Hey there, members of the Night Crew, and folks who just love horror. Welcome to the Night Crew podcast, where shadows breathe and monsters listen. This is the podcast where we get cozy with the creepy, the frightening, and the just plain undead. I'm your host, Brad Ricks. Couple things to note. First of all, it is pouring rain where I'm at right now. I don't know if the rain showers are coming through the microphone or not, but I definitely hear them, so I'm going to let them be ambiance. Some quick housekeeping before we get into it. If you've been enjoying the show, the best thing you can do is subscribe, leave a rating, and share an episode with one person who'd appreciate it. Just one person. That's the whole ask. Word of mouth is how this show grows. Signed copies of my novels are over at bradricks.com, and the Night Crew 3 Hunting Ground is on the way, July 3rd, don't forget. And did you see a review that I posted the other day? A scene that's so intense that it put a woman into labor. I mean, props, right? All right. You can also find me on Facebook. Just search Brad Ricks or join my reader group, Brad Ricks' Book Crypt. All right. Doors locked, lights low. If you're new here, welcome. We are 3 episodes deep in our series on the Succubus. Episode 1 was about Lilith and her demon daughters. Episode 2 was the global tour, the succubi cousins from Greece to Japan to the Philippines. Tonight is part 3, and we're walking into what is, in my opinion, the strangest and most disturbing chapter in this entire story. Tonight, we're talking about what happened when the Christian church got its hands on the succubus. Now, I want to be careful here. This episode is going to spend some time inside a worldview that produced some real suffering, like real executions, real people, mostly women, who died because of beliefs we're going to discuss. So, we're going to look at it head on. We're not going to flinch from it. We don't do that on the show. But we're also not going to make light of the human cost. The theology is bizarre. The math the church did about demon reproduction is, frankly, it's hilarious in places. The consequences, though, were not. So we'll hold both of those things at once. Tonight, we're going to talk about how the succubus stopped being a folktale your grandmother told you and became a courtroom exhibit. We're going to talk about the Malleus Maleficarum, the strangest theological document ever written about demon biology. We're going to talk about the witch trials. We're going to talk about a question that generally should have stopped this whole project in its tracks, but didn't, which is, if a demon visits a man and a woman, who exactly is at fault? Spoiler, it was the woman. It was always the woman. All right, pull the blanket up. Let's get into it. To understand how the succubus went from folklore to legal evidence, you have to understand something about the medieval Christian church. The church was, for most of the medieval period, the single most powerful institution in Europe. It controlled education, it controlled law, it controlled the calendar. It controlled what counted as truth and what counted as heresy. And starting around the 11th and 12th centuries, the church began doing something that earlier Christianity had mostly avoided. It began systematizing demons. Now, before this period, most Christian writing about demons was vague. There were demons. They were bad. They tempted people. Don't talk to them. That was about the depth of the conversation. But starting in the high medieval period, theologians began trying to organize the supernatural world the same way they were organizing everything else. They wanted hierarchies. They wanted categories. They wanted, for lack of a better word, they wanted a filing system for hell. And once you start filing demons, you start asking questions about them. What do they look like? What can they do? Can they touch the physical world? Can they have bodies? Can they, and this is where things are going to get really weird, can they have sex? Now, you might think the obvious answer here is, well, they're spirits, so no, they can't have sex. But medieval theologians were not in the business of giving obvious answers. The obvious answer is for laymen. Theologians, they kind of had a reputation to uphold. So a whole school of thought developed around the idea that demons could, in fact, interact with the physical world by taking on temporary bodies. Now, these bodies weren't real flesh. They were sort of, and forgive me, I am simplifying like centuries of complicated theology. They were like costumes. Demons could borrow a body for a night, do what they came to do, and then get rid of it before dawn. St. Augustine, all the way back in the 5th century, wrote that the rumors of demons having relations with humans were too widespread and too consistent to be entirely fabricated. Now, he didn't go all the way to confirming them, but he opened the door. And once Augustine opens a theological door, it stays open. I mean, he was kind of like that big a deal. And by the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, who is kind of depending on how you feel about Catholic theology, he's either the greatest thinker of the medieval era or the guy who really overcomplicated everything. So Thomas Aquinas had developed a full theory of demonic reproduction. Now, this is where I have to stop and just appreciate for a second what a strange document the Summa Theologica is. Aquinas, one of the most brilliant minds of his century, sat down and wrote serious philosophical arguments about how succubi and incubi work. Not like as a joke or, just folklore, but like as true theology. I mean, the church needed answers and somebody had to provide them. And the theory he settled on is genuinely one of the strangest ideas ever taken seriously by an organized religion. So, all right, here we go. I'm going to walk you through medieval demon reproductive theory. And I need you to stay with me because I promise the destination, it's so worth the trip. If you thought like human reproduction was that weird class you took in high school, buckle up. So the church had a problem. The problem was this. Demons are spirits. Spirits don't have biology. So if a demon visits a sleeping man and there is let's call it a physical outcome, where does that material go? And if a demon visits a sleeping woman and she becomes pregnant, and yes, that was a thing people genuinely worried about, where does that child come from? Demons don't necessarily have the necessary downstairs equipment. Spirits don't manufacture material. So what's going on? Aquinas' answer, and the answer that the church basically adopted, was this. A single demon does both jobs. First, the demon appears to a man as a succubus, a beautiful woman. The man does what men do in their sleep. The demon collects the material. Then, and this is the part that always kills me, the same demon flies somewhere else, possibly the same night, and appears to a woman as an incubus, a handsome man, and delivers the material it just collected. That's the theology. A demon is essentially a courier service. The succubus and the incubus are not two different beings. They are the same demon doing both halves of the same trip, with a stop in the middle. The world's worst Uber Eats route. And I want you to sit with how strange this is. Like real, ordained, educated men spent years debating this. They wrote books about it. They argued about the temperature of the material during transport, whether it cooled too much between the collection and the delivery, and whether that affected the resulting child. They argued about whether children born this way were fully human. There's a serious theological debate about whether the Antichrist would be born from a succubus-incubus delivery. There were even footnotes. So if you ever feel like you've spent too much time worrying about something silly? Just remember that for about 300 damn years, the most educated men in Europe were doing the math on demon obstetrics. Whatever you did this week, it was not the most pointless intellectual project in history. I'm fairly certain you're fine. Now, this theology had a function, and here's where the dark turn comes. Because as long as this is just academics arguing in libraries, it's pretty damn funny. It's strange. It's something to put in a textbook. It's something for us podcasters years later to make fun of. But the moment this theology leaves the library and enters the legal system, it stops being funny. In the late 15th century, that's exactly what happened. Two German Dominican priests, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer, took everything the theologians had been arguing about for centuries, and they wrote a book. A practical book. A how-to. The book was called the Malleus Maleficarum. The Hammer of Witches. And that book changed everything. The Malleus Maleficarum was published in 1486. For about 200 years, it was one of the best-selling books in Europe, second only to the Bible, in some regions during some decades. Well, that's it. The second most popular book on the continent for 2 centuries was a witch hunting manual. The Malleus does a few things. First, it argues that witches exist. Second, it argues that witches are mostly women. And the authors spend a long, ugly chapter explaining why. The reasoning is, by modern standards, indefensible. Women, the authors argue, are more credulous, more impressionable, more prone to carnal temptation, and therefore more vulnerable to demonic influence. That's the case. That's the whole case. But it became the legal standard. And third, and this is where our topic kind of comes back in. The Malleus argues that witches make pacts with demons, often through sexual encounters with incubi and succubi. The succubus-incubus delivery system, which had been an obscure theological debate, became evidence in court. A woman accused of witchcraft might be asked under interrogation whether she had ever had relations with an incubus. And the interrogation methods in question are not anything I'm going to describe in detail. Use your imaginations. The histories are public. They are bad. Once a confession was obtained, and they almost always were eventually, that confession became the legal record. The demon was real. The encounter was real. The witch was real. And I'm not going to give a Monty Python impersonation, but the witch was either burned or hanged or drowned, depending on the region and the year. Estimates of how many people were executed for witchcraft across Europe during this roughly 300-year period vary wildly. Older estimates ranged into the millions. Modern historical scholarship has kind of tightened that number up significantly. Most current estimates put it somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 executions, with the vast majority of the victims being women, and most of those women being poor, elderly, widowed, or otherwise marginalized. Not a single high-status woman in any of the records I've ever read. Just the ones at the bottom of the social pile. And the succubus, this creature that we started this series talking about as an ancient folklore and kind of a cultural ghost. Well, by the height of the witch trials, the succubus had become a piece of legal furniture. She was named in trial records. She was named in confessions. She was named in execution accounts. She was, in the literal sense, part of the system that killed those people. That's the part I want you to hold on to, because earlier in this series, we treated the succubus as a story, a folktale. a way that humans explain things they couldn't otherwise explain. And that's true. That's been true for most of her history. But for this one specific period, roughly 1480 to 1750, she stopped being a story. She became a charge, and the charge was capital. So the honest question, and the one we're going to spend the rest of this episode on, is what was actually happening here? Because nobody was actually being visited by demons in their sleep and waking up with detailed memories of the encounter. So what were people describing? Where did the confessions come from? And why did everyone on all sides seem to believe that something real was being talked about? There are several answers, and they're not mutually exclusive. They probably all overlap. The first answer is sleep paralysis. I mean, we talked about this in episode 2. Sleep paralysis is a real, well-documented neurological phenomenon. The sleeper wakes up, but the body remains paralyzed for several seconds, sometimes minutes. During this state, the brain often produces extremely vivid hallucinations. A common feature of these hallucinations is the sense of a presence in the room, often felt as predatory and also often felt as feminine. And it's often accompanied by a feeling of pressure on the chest and an inability to breathe. People experiencing this in the medieval period, when they didn't have any neurological framework, would have had only one available explanation. The succubus was in the room. She was on the chest. She was the reason for the paralysis. That alone accounts for a significant percentage of medieval succubus encounter reports. Just sleep paralysis. Just brains doing brain things. But the second answer is shame. And this one is harder to talk about, but hey, I'm going to try to be straight about it. Medieval Christianity treated sexual desire, and particularly sexual desire experienced by men in dreams outside of marriage, as a serious spiritual failing. A man who had a vivid sexual dream was supposed to feel deep guilt. He was supposed to confess it. He was supposed to be ashamed. The incubus in this framework became a very useful explanation. Because if a demon visited him, it wasn't his desire. It wasn't his fault. The succubus did it to him. He was a victim, not a sinner. The theology, in a way, gave men an out. It gave them somewhere to put the guilt that wasn't on themselves, which is, frankly, a pretty good trick. And it is not lost on me that the succubus, the female creature, was a convenient explanation that let men off the hook for their own internal experiences. We talked at the end of episode 2 about how the succubus across cultures tends to be the night version of an unresolved daytime crime. The Malleus is that idea on steroids. The Malleus is an entire legal system built on the premise that whatever happened, it was the woman's fault and the woman should be removed. And then the third answer, it's social. Witch accusations, looking at them across the historical record, almost never targeted random women. They targeted women who didn't fit, widows who controlled their own land, healers and midwives who knew things that priests didn't know, old women who lived alone, women with reputations, women without protectors, women who had crossed somebody powerful. The succubus charge was almost never the real reason somebody was on trial. The real reason was usually something messier and more political. The succubus charge was just the legal hook that allowed the system to do what it already wanted to do. That's the ugly truth at the bottom of medieval demonology. The theology was the costume. The actual operation was social control. And the succubus, this ancient, complicated, fascinating folklore figure got conscripted into a machine that used her name to do real harm. Now, I want to give you one more thing before we wrap, because I think it's important. The Malleus Maleficarum was never universally embraced. The Catholic Church itself had a complicated relationship with it. The Spanish Inquisition, of all institutions, actually viewed the Malleus with skepticism. They thought a lot of its claims were exaggerated, and a lot of its evidence standards were sloppy. There were medieval theologians who pushed back. There were jurists who refused to use it. There were communities that ignored it entirely. The witch trials were never a unified European event. They were waves in specific regions at specific times, often tied to local political crisis or economic stress. The picture is a lot more complicated than the cartoon version most of us kind of carry around. But complicated or not, the body count is real. The succubus was named in those records. And when we tell her story honestly, we have to include that part of it. Because if we don't, we're just kind of telling the cool half. So next time, we're going to bring her into the modern era. Sleep paralysis demons, the old hag phenomenon, modern paranormal encounter reports. And there are more of these than you'd think. So pop culture, video games, anime, the strange way the succubus has been rehabilitated from terrifying soul stealer into romanticized anti-hero. And we're going to end on some accounts that are recent enough that you may have to think twice about how settled this all really is. But that's next time. And that's it for the Night Crew podcast. Part 3 is in the books. And I appreciate you sticking with me through what I know was a heavier one. This series has had a lot of fun moments, and we'll get back to those next time. But tonight was the part of the story that had to be told straight. And I'd rather give you that than dress it up. All right. Reminders before we close out. Signed books and merch are at bradricks.com. Night Crew 300 Ground is coming. And the closer it gets, the louder I'm going to be about it. So consider this your fair warning. Catch me on Facebook and my new reader group, Brad Ricks' Book Crypt. And the best thing you can do for this show is share one episode with one person. That is a whole growth strategy. We're not complicated operation. I'm Brad Ricks, reminding you to stay out of graveyards after dark, question people who don't show up in mirrors, and tonight, when you say your prayers, or you don't say your prayers, or you do whatever it is you do before you sleep, take a minute to think about the people who got buried under all of this. They deserve better than what they got. The least we can do is remember. Until next time, keep your curtains drawn, your sense of humor sharp, and your blood inside your body. Thanks for listening.